Dear friends of the Asia Minor and Polish-Hellenic Research Center, I would like to say a few words regarding the Great Fire of Smyrna Centennial commemoration at the Holocaust Museum on September 18. The burning of Smyrna is a historic point of an enormous importance in both Greek and world history. For thousands of years, Greeks of Asia Minor flourished in Asia Minor and Pontus. The city of Smyrna was a cosmopolitan city, renowned for its tolerance of diversity. For centuries, Greeks, Armenians, Turks, and Jews lived and worked together. But after 1908, when the Young Turks took over the Ottoman leadership and government, and the nationalist government of Mustafa Kemal in 1919, there was no more room for any other minority, and Turkey was for Turks only. With so many years of collaboration with the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Educational Center, our research center is proud to organize another memorable event. The Smyrna Centennial Remembrance Conference 2022 was held in person at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Skokie. More than 330 people attended in person and about 300 online via Zoom on September 18. The event was organized by the Holocaust Museum and Education Center and the Asia Minor and Polish-Hellenic Research Center, AMPHRC. The 100th anniversary commemoration featured insights from the distinguished speakers, as well as testimonies from eyewitnesses in video clip from the AMPHRC's documentary film, Lethal Nationalism, Genocide of the Greeks, 1913-1923. Broadcast journalist and media executive John Davies, member of the board of directors for the Illinois Holocaust Museum and member of the executive board of the AMPHRC, served as a master of ceremonies for the event, noting the need to take a stand for humanity and raise awareness of the genocide of the Greeks of Asia Minor to prevent further atrocities. The museum stands with the Greek community, he said, to light the torch of truth to the world. The presentation started with welcoming remarks from Jessica Holden of the museum, who acted as a moderator. Distinguished guests included His Eminence Metropolitan Nathanael of Chicago, the Consul General of Greece in Chicago, Emanuel Koubarakis, the Republic of Armenia's Honorary Consul in Chicago, Oscar Tatosian, and Ms. Sanae Kano, representative of the Japanese Consul in Chicago.
Leadership, staff, and volunteers, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to this important commemorative event, the Great Fire of Smyrna, the final chapter of the genocide of the Greeks in Asia Minor, in collaboration with the Asia Minor and Pontus Hellenic Research Center, of which I'm also a board member. My name is John Davis, and I will be part of the emceeing crew for this fabulous and monumental and commemorative event. As the third largest Holocaust and Human Rights Museum in the world, our Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center inspires our visitors to become upstanders for social change, to speak out against injustice and genocide, and to lead by example. We activate this mission through world-class exhibitions, public programming, and educational initiatives that equip our audiences with the knowledge, the skills, and the courage to take a stand for humanity. In this age of historical revisionism and genocide denial, it is important for the museum to raise awareness of the past and current genocides, to remember the victims and the survivors, and to advocate to prevent future atrocities. Today, we remember and raise awareness of the genocides against the Greeks in Asia Minor. We will discuss what was lost during the Great Fire of Smyrna and reflect on the strength and the resilience of a community that has persevered despite the intent to destroy their culture. The museum stands with the Greek community and our partners to shed light on the historical events so together we can be guardians of its memory and light the torch of truth to the world. First of all, I would like to thank all of our community partners and for their continued support. That includes the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Chicago, and we are awaiting His Eminence, who we understand was not able to park the cars on the expressway. We'd like to also recognize as our community partner the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Hellenic Center, the National Hellenic Museum, the Center for Hellenic Studies at University of Chicago, Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Pontic Studies Department, the Hellenic American Leadership Council, the Armenian National Committee of Illinois, the Assyrian American Civil Club of Chicago, Enosis, Hellenic American Women's Council, the Hellenic Link Midwest, the Pan-Pontian Federation of the U.S. and Canada, and its president, Gus Silfides. Gus, will you please stand? Where's, it's Gus. Stand, please, and be recognized. Thank you. Along with the Pontic Greek Society of Chicago and the Pontian Youth Association of the U.S. and Canada, and of course, they're always very instrumental. It is very important that we continue to impress upon our young people in the next generation, whether it's 3G or 4G, to pick up the mantle. This is a discussion and this is a campaign that cannot end with us. As we await His Eminence, I would like to call up our board member, Stavros Baseas. He's a long-serving board member of the Asia Minor and Pontus Hellenic Research Center. Mr. Baseas is an ardent supporter of ANPHRC, and the center depends a great deal on his leadership. Mr. Baseas.
Thank you, John. On behalf of all of us at Asia Minor and Pontus Hellenic Research Center, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for the many years of support in organizing events such as this one today. The story of the burning of Smyrna is the story of mass death, destruction, and a basic universal human rights violation story. Many thanks to the Holocaust Museum's board, its members, and its dedicated staff, including Kelly Zani, Jessica Houghton, Matthew Circle, and their amazing staff for taking time from their busy schedules to work side by side with our team to organize this event. Likewise, we express our sincere appreciation to our presenters, Professor Paul Bartrop, who made his special trip all the way from Australia to be with us today, Professor Konstantin Hadjidimitriou from New York, who is a longtime supporter and academic advisor of our research center, and last and not least, Mr. George Sirinian, our Toronto-based author and friend, who has been a devoted mentor to our center since 2007. He has been a driving force in organizing academic conferences. He also has been instrumental with editing, publishing original research papers that were presented in the many conferences we have organized. Lastly, many thanks to our community partners for all of you for being here today to commemorate the centennial of the Great Fire of Smyrna, the Great Catastrophe, and the end of the Hellenic presence in the unforgettable homelands of over 3,000 years, the most tragic page in the history of Greece. Thank you.
His Eminence has arrived. I would like at this time to introduce to those of you who do not know him. You will be very impressed with him once you have met him and listened to him. His Eminence, Metropolitan Nathaniel of the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Chicago and the Midwest. The Greek Orthodox community is great, is very fortunate to have a young, great religious leader with great vision and compassion. Please welcome His Eminence, Nathaniel.
Good afternoon. I am terribly sorry for the delay. I didn't realize there's so much traffic coming up from the south side of Chicago all the way up here, so thank you for your patience with me. It's truly a great honor to be here with you all and to offer some words of reflection. Today's commemoration is truly indeed personal for me, as my family came from these parts of the world, from Asia Minor. They were forced to abandon their homes. Many of my family members just took what was in sight and marched to the first boat that they could find to help them find refuge in Greece. So thank you again for organizing this and for the hospitality at the Holocaust Museum. Beloved sisters and brothers, let me begin by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for generously hosting this historic event, and to the Asia Minor and Pontus Hellenic Research Center, the esteemed scholars participating in the symposium, and the many community partners who helped to make today's commemoration and presentations possible. There are occasions when we gather in joyful celebration, when we, as the psalmist says, sing to the Lord, sing praises to him, tell all of his marvelous works. There are other occasions when we gather in mourning, when we lament, pouring out our troubles and expressing our sadness before him. Today, however, is one of the rare occasions when there are no words to express what is in our hearts. When we are at most authentic, when we simply stand in silence before a mystery that is beyond our comprehension, beyond our capacity to process, beyond words. Really, no matter how careful we are, no matter how much reverence and respect we show toward those who lost their lives and those who suffered deep physical, emotional, and spiritual trauma during the Great Fire of Smyrna and at the hands of the Ottoman Turks more broadly, our words fail to capture the depth and horror of this event. And yet we absolutely must speak about it. We absolutely must study the historical sources, the personal accounts, and the concrete facts with scholarly integrity in order to never forget and never allow falsehoods to further desecrate the dignity of those who suffered. In other words, we are called to be silent and we are called to speak the truth today, 100 years after the Great Fire was perpetrated. As the presiding hierarch and spiritual leader of the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Chicago, I have a dual responsibility in relation to this commemoration. On the one hand, as I noted above, I have a duty to encourage scholarship that is conducted with integrity and shared with the public, so that the truth of this heroic chapter in human history is documented, remembered, and shared. A duty to remind those within my care of the demonic depths of violence and hatred human beings are capable of reaching. Yet on the other hand, without ever minimizing the raw and incomprehensible tragedy that the Greeks suffered, it is also my duty to help us heal spiritually and to experience the deepest and most authentic liberation that comes only from God and only through mercy, forgiveness, and love. Our Lord's words are clear in their meaning and absolute in their scope. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Beloved, while the great fire of Smyrna is a horror beyond words and an impenetrable mystery, an even greater mystery and capacity beyond words is the human heart's ability to love all people and seek reconciliation. Our task is to preserve and teach the historical truth, but it is also to eschew hatred, bigotry, and racism of any kind. I close with the words of one of our newest Orthodox saints, Saint Amphilochios of Patmos, and I quoted him last time I was here. "I was born to love people," he says. "It doesn't concern me if he is a Turk, black, or white. I see in the face of each person the image of God. And for this image of God, I am willing to sacrifice everything." Thank you.
Thank you, Your Eminence. I would also like to welcome to the museum the Consul General of Greece in Chicago, Mr. Emmanuel Koumbarakis. Would you like to say a few words? Please.
Thank you, Your Eminence, Σεβασμιότατε, Metropolitan Nathaniel, Mr. George Mavropoulos, President of the Asian Minor and Pontus Hellenic Research Center, distinguished guests, distinguished members of the board of the Holocaust Museum, I would like on behalf of the Hellenic Republic and the Greek Consulate, thank you for your hospitality and for hosting this commemoration, this event. It is also an honor because this afternoon I represent the Ambassador of Greece to the United States, Her Excellency Mrs. Alexandra Papadopoulou. Ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered here today to commemorate the Asia Minor catastrophe and its victims, both those who lost their lives and those who have been uprooted from their birthplaces. Greeks, Armenians, Jews. It is also an opportunity to reflect upon the historical events which led to the disaster and make a sincere effort to draw lessons from the past. We are honored by your presence in this heartful yet meaningful journey back in some of the darkest times that Hellenism and humanity have witnessed. 100 years ago, Smyrna was invaded and captured by Ottoman soldiers. Upon entering the city, the Turkish forces massacred thousands of innocent civilians, and on September 14th, set the Armenian and Greek quarters of the city ablaze. The fire endured for days and consumed what used to be a Jew of the Eastern Mediterranean. Tens of thousands were tortured and killed. Thousands of men were captured to serve as slave laborers. Over 1 million of forcibly displaced people were fortunate enough to escape in the absence of a solid evacuation plan, and as the Ottomans rummaged through the streets of the city, targeting, and I quote, the unfaithful. It is a genocide that the Turkish government has refused to acknowledge as such to this day. The Asia Minor catastrophe is burned into our collective memory. In a way, we grieve to this day for the loss of the ancestral homelands, which still bear marks of their glorious Hellenic past: Ephesus, Troy, Pergamon, Aphrodisia, Assos, Didyma. We mourn to this day for the loss of thousands of human lives and for the hardships of the civilians who have survived the Ottoman atrocities, carried the burden of trauma throughout their lives and into the next generations. Some of the victims' descendants are sitting among us this afternoon and will later share their testimonials. The Asia Minor catastrophe decisively influenced Hellenism and the formation of Greece, the new Greece. Approximately 1.5 million refugees arrived to the war-ravaged Greece. Pressing issues such as the immediate creation of reception centers and housing infrastructures, public health management, and vocational rehabilitation arose, and the newcomers' settlement and integration into the receiving communities was not without obstacles. However, it very soon became apparent that the Asia Minor population who sought shelter in Greece increased human capital in the interwar and post-war periods and propelled forward the Greek economy. The majority of the forcibly displaced were educated, cultivated, politically active, and socially engaged at a level that the Greek population had not yet conquered at the time. Their presence immensely transformed and enriched the Greek landscape in various ways. Specifically, they reinforced the working class in the urban centers, introduced new political ideas, and contributed to the appearance of new literary movements and the emergence of new musical currents, artistic expressions, and gastronomic practices. Greece, through the great effort, managed to overcome the Asia Minor disaster. In the years that followed, Greece was progressively growing and prospering to assume an important geostrategic role at the present time, always adhering to the principles and values that uphold the democratic world. This dark chapter of the history of Hellenism has been closed, and Greece focuses on the future as new challenges and dangers arise. We observe an increase in volatility at the international level and in our neighborhood. Ukraine's fights against Russia invasion, and the Turkish leadership yearns for the revival of the dissolved Ottoman Empire, while the world battles the pandemic, an imminent energy crisis, and the daunting risk of a new global economic crisis. Greece will once again stand its ground both literally and metaphorically. We will defend our national interests while serving as a pillar of stability and security in the southeastern Mediterranean and the Balkans. Greece will keep acting in good faith in favor of the peripheral peace and prosperity it will remain an effective and accountable ally to its many allies and will fulfill its international obligations. If there is a lesson to learn by revisiting the great Asia Minor catastrophe, is that when Greeks act in spirit of unity and solidarity, they can, against all odds, overcome even the most adverse circumstances. Thank you again for participating in today's event for the centennial commemoration of the Asia Minor catastrophe. We would like also to welcome you to attend our upcoming concert, Echoes of the Past, Asia Minor in Greek Songs, that will take place on Sunday, October 9th at the University of Chicago. We organized this event together with the University of Chicago, the Hellenic Center, and the Center for Research of Asia Minor and Pontus. And I hope that you will enjoy listening today to the speakers and wish you a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kumbarakis. While the city of Smyrna was burning, there were many foreign ships, including warships and cargo freighters, just offshore. Several of those ships literally played loud music in order to drown out the horrifying sounds of men, women, and children screaming for help. But one ship, the Tokai Moru, a Japanese cargo ship, threw its valuable merchandise overboard in order to make room to save more than 800 lives. We would like to thank the Japanese government, invading Turkish soldiers, through Ms. Sanai Kano, Head of General Affairs Department representing the Consul General of Japan in Chicago, Mr. Tajima. Please let us all stand, if you are able, stand and applaud the Japanese government for this selfless act of historic and heroic bravery. Ms. Kano.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation. I'm sorry, I didn't expect to give a speech today. But before receiving the kind invitation, our office actually didn't know about what our Japanese ancestors did. And I researched on this event, and I was deeply impressed how our Japanese ancestors did during the tragedy. And I'm so much honored to be here on behalf of the Japanese government, on behalf of Japanese people. And I really would like to thank you, people here and the Greek people, for remembering over a century our ancestors' heroic humanitarian activity there. Thank you so much for inviting us.
And we just have one other small diplomatic chore, and we have, and this is wonderful and it's great that he is here, Mr. Aske Tetosian, who is the Armenian Consul General. Where are you? Oh, please come. Please come forward. I mean, Everyone, please sit here. Thank you, Mr. Tatosian, for being here. Your presence means a lot to us. Now it is my pleasure to introduce one of the hardest working, most dedicated team members here at the Holocaust Museum, a young lady who represents the very best of this institution and is a dynamo. Her leadership and guidance really brought this event together today. Please welcome Jessica Hulton, the Assistant Manager of Education, who will introduce our speakers for the day.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. I am honored to be a part of this commemoration and thrilled to be able to introduce our speakers for today's program. Our first speaker today is scholar Dr. George Sherinian. Sherinian was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, the son of 2 orphan survivors of the Armenian genocide. For over 20 years, until retiring, he served as the executive director of the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Study, a division of the Zorian Institute, which is devoted to research, publication, and education in the fields of genocide studies, diaspora studies, and Armenia studies. He was an official of the journal Genocide Studies International and one of the organizers of the annual Genocide and Human Rights University program run in partnership with the University of Toronto. He is the author of articles on the Armenian Genocide, a contributor to the Armenian Genocide, the Essential Reference Guide, co-editor of the Studies in Comparative Genocide, and editor to the Asia Minor Catastrophe and the Ottoman Greek Genocide, Essays on Asia Minor, Pontus, and Eastern Threat, and many others. His most recent publication is the chapter Collective State Violence Against Greeks in the Late Ottoman Empire, in the Collective and State Violence in Turkey, the Construction of the National Identity from Empire to Nation State. It is an honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. George Sherinian to the stage.
Thank you. It's an honor to be invited to be here with you today. I'm very pleased to see the large number of people in attendance.
PowerPoint clicker.
Thank you, I'll need that. My role in the program is to give some background on SMYRNA, describe briefly the events leading up to the Great Fire, and provide context on why it happened. SMYRNA was blessed by its geographic position, an excellent harbor, to become a major center of international trade. In 1876, a new stone quay was finished, replacing the 400-year-old wooden one and expanding the quay to 2 miles in length and 30 yards in depth. The busiest port in the region, by 1900, 55% of all Ottoman exports passed through SMYRNA. Exports included cotton, figs, grain, raisins, tobacco, and opium. The local economy was also based on factories and mills producing such things as carpets and silk. The city's commerce attracted people from various countries and of many ethnicities to settle there. The social interaction accompanying commerce caused the old social organization of the city to evolve into an arrangement in which economic and social status were more important than ethnic and religious affiliation. One of the characteristics most associated with SMYRNA is its cosmopolitanism. This city of the world represented the idea that all its residents, regardless of their ethnic, religious, cultural, or political identification, had an openness toward and tolerance of the ideas and values of others, and the ability to live together constructively and in peace. There was practical freedom of religion for Christians and Jews. The Greeks were able to build new churches and schools, even though it was not permitted by Sharia law. It is difficult to get exact and consistent population figures. The pre-World War I population was estimated at 165,000 Turks, 155,000 Greeks, of whom 115,000 were Turkish citizens and 40,000 citizens of Greece, 35,000 Jews, 25,000 Armenians, and 20,000 others. This diversity created a wonderful society, different from other Ottoman cities. Smyrna was a prosperous city with a lively educational and cultural life, and the key was at the center of both commerce and recreation. Lit by gas lamps, it had numerous cafes, and Oriental and European music was heard all around. It was a fashionable, popular area where large numbers of people would promenade in the evenings. The city's cultural richness was manifested in many ways. The first printing press in Smyrna was Jewish, established in 1649. More than 400 titles, mostly of rabbinical literature, were printed there from the 18th to the early 20th century by 12 different printers. In 1872, there were 10 Greek language printing presses, 3 Armenian, 2 French, 1 Ottoman, and 1 Hebrew. By 1910, 14 of the 26 presses were Greek. The first newspaper in the Ottoman Empire was founded in Smyrna. By 1890, there were 4 Greek newspapers, 3 Turkish, 3 French, 3 Latino. Muslim women in Smyrna were famous for not following the Islamic dress code. Despite repeated injunctions to return to Sharia, they walked on the cordon with thin veils or none at all, and in tight coats to show off their figure. In contrast to Constantinople, in Smyrna, men and women sometimes traveled together on trams and boats, rather than in the separate sections for its sex. Despite such vanities, the city had a sense of community, and there were many charities run by Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Turks. As an example of interethnic cooperation, an Ottoman Chamber of Commerce was established in 1885 with an Armenian president and Turkish, Greek, Armenian, and Jewish members. There were numerous schools, including girls' schools. Jewish schools were promoters of French culture. American missionary schools taught in English. Most of their pupils were Armenians and Greeks, who later converted to Protestantism. The Christian-run schools taught subjects to help students succeed in business, such as languages, mathematics, and economics, while the Turkish schools did not. The 76 Greek-run schools were considered the best in the city, and some of them attracted not only Greek, but also French, Muslim, and Jewish students. There were 11 Turkish, 12 Armenian, and 19 Jewish schools. There were libraries and reading rooms, public lectures, theatrical performances, and sports clubs. Of the 1,300 books published in Smyrna before 1922, many were translations of French works. The city was multilingual, with Ottoman, French, Greek, Armenian, and Hebrew commonly used in business. Greek was the principal language spoken by most, except for the Turks. French was the language of society and the educated classes. English was spoken by many of the Christians and Jews. Not only did Smyrna have the Ottoman Empire's first newspaper, it also had its first American school, first race course, first electricity, first soccer team, first car, and first public cinema. The Greek presence was strong. Most banks were Greek. Half the leading merchants, lawyers, and doctors were Greek. The Greeks had their own museum with 40,000 books and collections of sculpture, inscriptions, medals, and it published monographs celebrating the region's Greek past. When the Sultan was overthrown in 1908, the streets of Smyrna were hung with Turkish, Greek, and Italian flags, along with banners proclaiming in Armenian, French, Greek, and Ottoman, liberty, equality, justice, fraternity, long live the Constitution, and so on. While Smyrna had a reputation as being tolerant, however, there was a malaise throughout the empire. As early as the 1850s, a British observer wrote during his stay in Smyrna that the Greek, quote, is distinguished by his desire to better his condition and rise in the world. That their cafe walls are almost invariably hung thickly with prints of scenes and heroes of the Greek War of Independence, and an enmity to everything Turkish, which is so universally found in all classes of Greeks. He asserted that much of this hatred is to be ascribed to the comparatively recent occurrences of the War of Independence, when the vilest passions and the vilest characters had freedom and abundant opportunity for the perpetration of every kind of cruelty, but much also was due to other causes. He went on to explain that extortion and bribery were commonplace. But there is a third cause, he said, besides these two, which has operated more powerfully than both of them combined, to imbue the whole Greek nature with the principle of hatred to the Turk. This cause is the insolence of the Turk in the daily transaction of common life, and his proneness to inflict personal outrage. A Greek in the distinctive dress of his race could never enter the Turkish quarter of the town in which he lived without running great risk of suffering personal violence. And even in other parts of the town, it was not unusual for a Greek to be saluted with the appellation gaur, and a blow at the same instant from an uneducated fanatical Turk. In numberless other ways, the Turk has been wont to remind the Raya of his subordinate position by methods which, while they envenomed and alienated the feelings of their subject forever, served to gratify his own splenetic impulse only for an instant. A century of political and military conflict between Greece and the Ottoman Empire preceded the destruction of Smyrna. Starting in the 1890s, the Armenians also expressed their desire for relief from Ottoman oppression, suffering a devastating series of massacres in 1894 and the years following. The Ottoman ruling elite considered it their sacred right to dominate the infidel non-Muslims and deeply resented these efforts. Greek and Armenian challenges to Ottoman sovereignty suited the European powers, which coveted the resources and wealth of the Ottoman Empire. They encouraged the Greeks and Armenians in their efforts at reform or independence, interfering on numerous occasions with Ottoman internal affairs on their behalf, and often seizing territory away from the empire. The Christian minorities were a highly visible and easy target for revenge. Representing only 13% of the population, they were economically far more successful than the Muslim majority. This was due to many factors, including their language, education, relations with foreign merchants and governments, and their drive to get ahead. In addition to foreign trade, the non-Muslims were well represented in banking and money lending, mechanized transport, export-oriented agriculture, and modern industries. They were also prominent in the professions, such as medicine, pharmacy, engineering, law, and teaching. As just one example of Greek economic success, in 1922, there were 391 factories in Smyrna, 88% of which were Greek-owned. It wasn't long before the sense of fraternity arising from the overthrow of the Sultan was overcome by envy, turned to open hostility, and developed into extreme Turkish nationalism, which blamed the non-Muslims for all the country's problems. The transition from envy to violence is illustrated in pamphlets, speeches, and editorials, such as the following. The Christians, profiting from our ignorance, have now for ages been taking our place and taking away our rights. These vipers, whom we are nourishing, have been sucking out all the lifeblood of the nation. They are the parasitical worms eating into our flesh, whom we must destroy and do away with. It is time we freed ourselves from these individuals by all means, lawful and unlawful. After mass violence against Greeks during the two Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913, there were government-organized anti-Greek and anti-Armenian measures in 1913 and 1914, including economic boycotts, forced expulsion, plundering, destruction, and massacre. In April 1914, the Armenian Reform Commission, under the jurisdiction of the Allied powers, planned to visit and reorganize the Armenians into two provinces in which they would have equal say in the administration. This was so unacceptable to the ruling Young Turks that they entered the Ottoman Empire into World War I on the side of Germany. Suffering an immediate military loss, it suited them to blame the Armenians, and in April 1915, they started an organized process of genocide to eliminate all the Armenians in the empire. The Assyrians too were targeted for genocide, along with the Armenians. The collective violence against the Greeks evolved into genocide, culminating in the Greco-Turkish War, the burning of Smyrna, and its aftermath. To end persecution and violence against Greek civilians after the First World War, and to thwart Italy's plans to take Smyrna, the Allied powers sent Greek troops there in May 1919. They were met with a growing Turkish insurgency led by Mustafa Kemal. Initially, the Greek army conducted a successful campaign. However, when King Constantine was called back to rule Greece, the Allied powers were firmly opposed and stated that they would no longer provide Greece with financial support. Meanwhile, Kemal signed a treaty with Russia, as a result of which Russia provided him with arms and 10 million rubles. In late July 1921, the Greek army, having run out of supplies, was uncertain about its strategy and stopped its advance. This allowed Kemal critical time to resupply and regroup. The Greeks lost a critical battle at the Sakarya River on September 13th, leading France to make a separate peace with Turkey. France also supplied Kemal with arms. In August 1922, Kemal attacked, and by the 30th, successfully routed the Greek forces. The next day, Kemal began pursuing the retreating Greeks all the way to Smyrna. During their disorderly retreat, and as a byproduct of a scorched earth policy, Greek troops committed atrocities against Turkish civilians. The Muslim population and Turkish troops behaved the same way towards the local Christian civilians. Signaling his intentions on September 10th, Kemal sent a note to the League of Nations stating, on account of the excited spirit of the Turkish population, the Angora government would not be responsible for massacres. There are numerous eyewitness accounts documenting what transpired. I will give only a few briefly. I'm not advancing. Okay. Delayed reaction. One of the first Turkish acts of violence in Smyrna was reported by René Poul, correspondent of the Paris newspaper Le Temps. He described the death of Greek Archbishop Chrysostom on September 9th as follows. General Nuruddin Pasha had searched for him. Upon his arrival, he covered him with insults, reproached him for his Philhellenic attitude during the Greek occupation, and informed him finally that the revolutionary tribunal in Ankara had condemned him to death a long time ago. Nuruddin added that all that was left for him to do was to deliver him to the judgment of the populace. Then Monsignor Chrysostom was thrust into the midst of a frenzied Muslim crowd who grabbed him by the beard, stabbed him, and dragged his quartered body to the Turkish quarter, where it was given to the dogs. One British sailor related that the carnage and cruelty to the Greek civilians was indescribable. We saw from where we were, just off the shore, the Turks bayoneting bodies, men, women, and children, through the windows of their homes. Hundreds of Greek civilians, as well as troops, hanging over the dock waterside, and the Turkish soldier coming along and deliberately severing the victim's arms, resulting in hundreds of bodies falling to their death in the sea. On September 12th, the U.S. consul in Smyrna reported to Washington. The 3 days and nights since the arrival of the Turkish forces in town had been a time of indescribable peril and disaster for the native Christian population. Looting, especially in the Armenian and Jewish section, has been generally, thoroughly, and systematically carried on. shops being broken into and their contents carried away, even horses and carts being used for this purpose. There has not been a general massacre, but there has been much killing. It would be impossible to say how many people, chiefly Armenians, have been shot or stabbed, but persons walking through the streets in that part of the town report seeing dead bodies everywhere. A party of Americans saw 9 cartloads of dead bodies being carried off in the neighborhood of the Konak, and another party saw 3 such cartloads in the neighborhood of Point Station. On September 13th, the U.S. High Commissioner in Constantinople sent a report stating, "Refugee situation appalling and no relief in sight. Approximately 300,000 refugees distributed throughout the city, with practically no food at present and little prospects of receiving any." On September 18th, the U.S. Consul in Smyrna reported, "Small squads of regular Turkish troops under petty officers patrolled the streets, hunting down Armenians. These they killed on the spot, or collected into companies and took outside the town and shot. Looting went on a vast scale in the Armenian and Greek quarters of the city and suburbs, and even the houses of the most prominent foreign residents, British or other subjects, were looted. Many cases of outrage upon women were reported." The night of the 12th was quiet and people breathed more freely, but the morning revealed the fact that systematic looting and slaughter had been quietly carried out during the night by troops of the regular Turkish army. On Wednesday afternoon, the 13th, fire added to the horror of the situation. The consul's report continued. "The responsibility for the fire is hard to fix, but I mention the facts as they are known to all persons. It started in several places in some buildings in the Armenian quarter near the American Girls' School. It was set at a time when the wind was blowing strongly away from the Turkish quarter and in such a direction as to involve almost immediately this old and excellent institution and sweep through the Armenian quarter. Armenians could not have set this fire as the place was overrun by Turkish soldiers. The houses had all been looted and no Armenian would have been left alive who was seen in that neighborhood. It was a place of deserted and looted houses from which the Armenians had been cleaned out. Miss Minnie Mills, sub-director of the girls' school, says that she saw Turkish soldiers going into houses with tins and that soon afterward the buildings burst into flame. She is a lady well known to be of the highest credibility and will accept no denial or qualification of her statements." With the city burning behind them, the terrified population crowded onto the quay. After initial inaction on grounds of neutrality, European, Japanese, and American ships, watching the destruction while anchored just off the harbor, made a chaotic effort at rescue. Eventually, Kemal allowed Greek ships to take refugees away, but informed the Allied powers that all evacuations were to cease on October the 1st. Turkish Commander Nureddin claimed that any refugees remaining in Smyrna after that date would be massacred. While thousands of refugees were able to escape by sea, thousands of others, especially males, were detained and marched into the interior, where they were killed or left to die of exposure or starvation. Thousands died of dysentery, typhus, and cholera. Eventually, most of the Greek population of the Ottoman Empire was expelled through a compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey. In total, over 1 million refugees wound up in Greece. The story of Smyrna is largely forgotten today. This is surprising, considering the magnitude of the death and destruction, the number of eyewitnesses, and the extent of the reporting at the time. There are lessons from Smyrna for today, relating to the dangers of extreme nationalism, the conflict between strategic national interests and the preservation of universal human rights, and the supremacy of commerce over justice. It is a shocking example of how ethnic and religious minorities in a single city can be targeted for elimination, foreshadowing the slaughter and deportation of Bosnians in Srebrenica in July 1995, an event which the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, declared in 2004 to be genocidal. There has been no such reckoning for Smyrna. That is why we must keep alive the memory of the Great Fire, which was so catastrophic and remains a trauma for both the Greek and Armenian people. Thank you.
Our next presenter, Dr. Constantine Hatzidimitriou, will discuss the destruction of Smyrna and its aftermath. Hatzidimitriou received his doctorate from Columbia University in Byzantine, Ottoman, Modern Greek History. He was Gennadius Fellow at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, Educational Counselor at the U.S. Consulate and Fulbright Office in Thessaloniki, and an administrator and professor at Anatolia College. He is a fellow of the American Hellenic Institute Foundation in Washington, D.C., editor of its 2 academic journals, and has taught at various universities in the New York City area, most recently at Queens College Center for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies. Among his books are American Accounts Documenting the Destruction of Smyrna, and Founded on Freedom and Virtue, documents illustrating the impact in the United States of the Greek War of Independence. He has published many studies in scholarly journals and contributed chapters to books, such as a supplementary study on Turkish responsibility for the Smyrna fire and the American cover-up, which appeared in 2012, and a recent article on George Horton's Blight of Asia, published in 2022. His new book chapter on the persecution and destruction of American educational institutions in Asia Minor, such as Anatolia College for the Turks, is expected to appear early next year. His mother, Ellie Lenakis Hatzidimitriou, and her entire family survived the Smyrna catastrophe during 1922. I now welcome Dr. Hatzidimitriou to the stage.
First of all, I want to thank George Mavropoulos and the Asia Minor and Pontus Hellenic Research Center for inviting me to address you tonight, and the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for organizing this event. We are here to note a monumental tragedy. 100 years have passed since the Great Fire that engulfed Smyrna, the massacre of its helpless population, and the genocide of Anatolian Christians, which destroyed Anatolian Hellenism where it flourished for thousands of years. This Turkish genocide, in a sense, continues because a century later, its government and leaders continue to deny what took place and have the audacity to blame the victims instead of taking responsibility for their actions. Scholars call this genocide denial the final stage of the process. It is also tragic that the United States government, which rightly celebrates its humanitarian values, continues to refrain from any specific official recognition of this horrific genocide and has yet to acknowledge the truth of what happened to the Anatolian Greeks and why. That this is the case, despite what its own documents reveal, it continues a pattern that began in 1922, in which political and economic interests are still used today to absolve the Turks and distort and cover up the truth. Although I'm a historian and accustomed to studying and speaking about the past, the tragic events and the people we are here to remember are not just an academic exercise for me. It's all personal, because I am the son of Anatolians. My mother, Ellie, was born in Budza, a beautiful suburb of Smyrna, one of Hellenism's great cosmopolitan centers, which tragically, like so many others, no longer exists. I came to this subject because of a key, the key to our house in Budza, which was something that I learned about as a child. I had the catastrophe. My grandparents kept this key throughout their lives and always expected and hoped to go home to their Hameni Patrida, the lost homeland, but they never did. It's taken me over 30 years to piece together the story that I will summarize for you tonight. My purpose was just not to find out exactly what happened, but to find proof that the Turks deliberately set the fire to the city and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of innocent people, and why they did so. The results of my research were published in 2005 in a book and a detailed article in 2012. I am happy to announce that this past summer, my book appeared in a new, updated, modern Greek edition to mark the centennial. Tonight, if I have time, I will also show you two relatively unknown documents concerning the U.S. cover-up, and you would be the first people to see them. The precise number of the Greek population of Asia Minor and the numbers killed and expelled between 1909 and 1924 has been the topic of controversy among scholars and politicians. Using archival data, I concluded that a minimum of 735,370 people were systematically massacred, and that at least about 1 million more were ethnically cleansed and forced to leave as part of the so-called exchange. This resulted in what the Turks call Turkey for the Turks. After World War I, as we've seen, the great powers gave Greece the right to occupy Smyrna and landed an army there in 1919. This was one of Venice's and Smyrna's destruction. The U.S. State Department considered both of these accounts biased and ignored and minimized them. It is important to note that the economic context, and especially oil, played a big role in all of these events in determining U.S. policy in the region. For example, in my book, I published a State Department document dated July 6, 1922, in which the Secretary of State referred to negotiations with the Turkish nationalists concerning railway, mining, and other commercial rights in Anatolia. Unofficial commercial representatives were negotiating with a government not yet recognized by the United States for economic gain, in the midst of a war and the widespread massacre of Christians. Other documents refer to the so-called Chester concessions, pre-World War II commercial agreements that were being negotiated again at this time. By going through the U.S. State Department archives, I found that our government not only had economic representatives on the scene, but as one would expect, intelligence officers connected to the military whose job was to report and supplement information being sent to Washington through official diplomatic channels such as Consul Horton. Admiral Bristol, the senior American diplomat in Constantinople, well known for his pro-Turkish bias, played a key role in controlling and manipulating all of this information, which reached Washington. And his friend and former secretary, Allen Dulles, worked with him to make certain that his views were prioritized within the State Department. In this connection, it is also worth noting that both the State Department and the Harding administration had strong ties to the American oil industry, especially Standard Oil, a subject which needs further attention and investigation. In fact, the Standard Oil facility near Smyrna Harbor was not burned and suffered no damage during the fire. It was these economic interests that played a key role in how the U.S. handled any information concerning Turkish atrocities and responsibilities. Through my research in the American archives, I found 4 key documents that prove that the U.S. and British governments had confirmed that the Turks burned the city and covered it up. Number 1, a wire telegraph from Lieutenant A.S. Merrill, Bristol's intelligence officer. All of these were secret documents, by the way, dated 9/14, which says that the Turks burned the city to solve their minority problem. Document number 2, we have a summary document of reports given to Secretary of State Hughes, dated September 15, which specifically states that based on many official reports, the Turks deliberately burned the city as part of a plan to solve their minority problem. Merrill kept a diary that became part of the official record, and this is document number 3, and was put into the State Department archives. In it, he recorded that 2 American sailors that were stationed ashore reported to him that they had seen Turkish soldiers throwing rags soaked in oil into the homes to spread the fire, and elsewhere repeated his opinion that he believed that the Turks burned the city as a matter of policy to prevent the Christians from returning. And finally, document number 4. We have a lengthy, confidential British document sent to the State Department, which indicates that based on numerous reports they received, they had determined that the Turks had systematically burned the city as part of a deliberate policy, and also asked if the United States had similar information. I'm going to stop for a moment. Take a look at the way these documents look. If you notice on the side, they have what are called index numbers. So if you wanted to locate the document in the American State Department archives, you look up that index number. And you can find the same document that you see here in a photocopy and check it. So these 4 key documents, which indicate what took place and what the Americans knew, are available for anyone to look at. They're originally classified, and following the rules, they were declassified. Now that I've reviewed the information that the American government had, let's briefly consider several official actions that illustrate how the cover-up operated. For example, we know that the U.S. had numerous sources of information that corroborated the British information they received. Yet, in the response to the British request, they sent them a report by Vice Consul Barnes that minimized Turkish culpability rather than anything by George Horton, his superior, or other documents such as those by Merrill and others. This suppression of truth enabled the Turks to deny responsibility, which continues today. We also know that the State Department officials lied to Congress. For example, when Henry Cabot Lodge, a prominent U.S. senator with ties to the Greek American community, sent an official inquiry dated February 24th, 1923, to the State Department as to what happened in Smyrna, and specifically asked what happened to the consulate and who was responsible for the fire, this is what the secretary responded officially. As the consulate building was destroyed in the general conflagration, it is not possible to attribute the destruction of this particular building to the individual act of any persons or person. As far as the department is informed, the authors of the fires, apparently of incendiary origin, which brought on the Smyrna conflagration, have never been apprehended, nor their identity discovered. On this point, conflicting evidence has been received by the department, and various antagonistic racial groups in Smyrna have attributed the origin of the fire to each other. End of quote. Obviously, they lied to the senator. In fact, the State Department knew that the Turks burned the consulate since 2 Americans, Vice Consul Barnes and Clifton Davis, a Red Cross official, both saw them do it. And Davis even put his hands in the mud, and it was created and it smelled like petroleum and gasoline mixed together. Yet the State Department reported to Senator Lodge that they didn't know who was responsible. We also have a lengthy and detailed document written by the Near East Division of the State Department, which suppressed and distorted the information it had about the fire and the massacres in order to minimize and counter the accusations made in Bierstadt's famous book. Even Dulles' handwritten notes survive. There's the handwritten notes, in which indicate that information about massacres were not to be mentioned under any circumstances. And elsewhere, it was again claimed that the U.S. did not know who started the fire or burned the consulate. In fact, the document shows how the Near East Division struggled to deal with the many accusations and facts concerning Turkish atrocities in Bierstadt's book in order to minimize any Turkish responsibility. Finally, there are two other documents which add to our knowledge that have recently come to my attention and I intend to publish in the near future. The first I owe to my friend and colleague, Stavros Stavridis in Australia, and it contains a lengthy record of hearings before a congressional committee on immigration and naturalization, which met in December 1922 to consider a bill to allow Greek refugees with American relatives from Smyrna into the United States. In it, various individuals, including Consul Horton, Esther Lovejoy, provided eyewitness testimony to congressional representatives concerning the fire, massacres, and Turkish responsibility. Although the refugee bill was not passed, the congressional record indicates that they certainly, even the Congress and the State Department, again, knew this information and clearly ignored it. The second document, and I'm wrapping up, comes from the State Department itself, dated April 22nd, 1929, that I found in the archives and remains unpublished. It is their response to an inquiry by one George Chikiris of St. Louis, Missouri, concerning his father, who he believes was being forcibly detained in Turkey, who has been there since 1922. Despite information they received from both the U.S. and Greek consulates in Smyrna that he was probably killed, the State Department responded to his son that the Turks know nothing about him and that he may have been repatriated or had escaped. Apparently, as late as 1929, the State Department could still not admit to the possibility that the Turks had murdered any of their Greek prisoners. Stavros Stavridis has uncovered many other similar documents concerning the search for missing family members by Greek Americans that date into the 1930s. The subject of the enslavement and eventual murder of many of these Greek prisoners is another subject in need of further research. Now, I rest my case before the court of public opinion. And as I've written, I call this U.S. government conspiracy of lies and deception, which I think I have proved, SMYRNA-gate. From now on, please do not let anyone say that the Turks did not burn the city or commit genocide. We have the proof. The official American evidence speaks for itself. Additionally, we must almost remember that individual Americans and the public were better than their government and saved thousands of lives.
Lethal nationalism. The Asia Minor and Pontus Atlantic Research Center is proud to present a glimpse of its award-winning documentary, Lethal Nationalism, The Genocide of the Greeks, 1913 to 1923. This film chronicles the systematic and brutal destruction of Greek communities of Asia Minor that led to the genocide of more than, as you've heard already, more than 700,000 Greeks and the forced migration of more than 1 million others. Many of these actual accounts were rarely seen or discussed publicly until this film brought them to light.
Lethal nationalism, genocide of the Greeks.
Kemal then issued an official declaration that all Smyrna's people would be respected and that order would prevail. It did not. One historian called the events of the next 2 weeks a humanitarian disaster on a scale that the world had never before seen. The Ottoman Greek genocide had annihilated the Ottoman Greeks of eastern Thrace and the Aegean coast. Then it crushed the Greeks of Pontus. Now it put a bullseye on the backs of Smyrna's enormous Greek population. On September 9th at 9 a.m., the Turkish nationalists entered the city. Kemal had installed Nurettin Pasha, a notorious Christian hater, as the city's governor. The French consul and the Catholic archbishop both offered an escape plan for Archbishop Chrysostomus, the leader of the Greek Orthodox Church in Smyrna. He declined the offer, saying the shepherd had to stay with his flock. Hours later, a French observer stared as a Turkish lynch mob made Chrysostomus one of the first to fall.
They come on his field. They gouge his eyes out. They cut off his nose and ears.
On September 10th, Mustafa Kemal entered the city, taking command of the former Greek army headquarters. 3 days later, after the wind shifted, Kemalist fighters set fire to the city's Armenian quarter, which soon spread to the Greek quarter. The flames never touched the Turkish quarter.
Από τη μια φωτιάστηκε από ένα μέγαρο στάδιο, από το ένα σπίτι στάδιο. Γεμίσαν τα μπετούμια σκαπνό. Τα χωρίζε, τα πάνε στα παόλα και βουδούσαν μέσα στα σπίτια. Βουδούσαν τους τα πέραν τα κορίτσια. Οι τούτοι τα πέραν τα κορίτσια. Και τα χώνανε οι μανάδες μες στα παόλα να τα γλιτώσουν. Και βουδούσαν μέσα στα σπίτια.
500,000 refugees and Smyrna residents rushed to the seaside docks to escape flames rising 200 feet. The Turks put a machine gun nest at one end. The Christians were trapped.
Μας κυνηγούσαν οι Τούρκοι στην παραλία της Σμύρνης. Φορούσες δαχτυλίδι στο χέρι. Δεν περιμένανε να το κάνεις. Τάκ με το μαχαίρι σου το κόβανε. Φορούσες κουλαφί και τάκ δαχτυλί σου στο κόβανε. Και να είναι τα πτώματα 1 μέτρο να πατάς απάνω στους άλλους για να προχωρείτε. Πώς να προχωρήσει ο κόσμος που βάζανε ζώνη για να διαλέγει τα κορίτσια, να διαλέγει τα παλικάρια.
An American physician recorded what he saw.
People throwing themselves into the sea to be drowned, the crash of falling buildings, the shots on the docks, homicide and suicide, all combined to make the night one long, horrible, fiendish nightmare.
A reporter for National Geographic wrote,
"Within that multitude, so densely packed that one could not lie down without being crushed to death, women gave birth to stillborn babies and sheltered them against their dried up breasts for lack of a burial place." National Geographic.
27 Allied ships, including 3 American destroyers, bobbed in the harbor a few hundred yards from the screaming Christians. The fleet was under orders to maintain strict neutrality and ignore the victims. The Allies did not want to appear to favor Greece. The prospect of many years of commerce with Turkey trumped any concerns about the hounds of the hunted. To mute the screams from the docks, one Allied warship ordered its band to play. Ship captains held formal dinners aboard the ships during the horrors on the docks. One tardy French official excused his lateness with this explanation, quote, "The motor launch hit continuously upon the floating corpses of Greek women." Up to 100,000 bodies floated in Smyrna's harbor. and filled the streets. The Allied force could have prevented the tragedy of Smyrna.
And they decided to occupy Smyrna with their own troops until everybody got out. They could have saved enormous loss of life. Could have been done. Should have been done.
Finally, a naval officer, moved by the barbaric chaos, approached the British admiral.
His chief of staff argued so strongly that he eventually did allow the British forward pulling boats and their motor launches into the pier to take people off. According to Archer Doctrine, they saved 20,000 at that time. But after that fire was over, back into this neutrality.
With the ember still smoldering, Kemal's commander in Smyrna declared that all the remaining Christian men of military age would be marched into the interior as prisoners of war. The Turks separated the men from their parents, sisters, wives, and children. The lucky ones were shot dead. The unlucky sent to the death of the trail. Elias Venesis, later to become a major Greek novelist, did not die. The Kemalists forced him at age 18 into a battalion of 3,000. He and 22 others survived. More than 100,000 women and children menaced on the docks. Kemal's governor gave them 2 weeks before they would face what were called uncertain consequences. In the crush, children slipped from the grips of their mothers.
Mothers in the strength of madness climbed the steel fences 15 feet high, and in the face of blows from the butts of guns sought their children, who ran about screaming. Dr. Esther Lovejoy, the American Red Cross.
A heroic YMCA worker eventually persuaded the Turks to allow Greek transport ships to rescue the messes on the docks. They were taken to camps and holding areas on nearby Greek islands. Within 10 months, 70,000 had died of starvation and disease in those refugee camps. After the Smyrna massacre, no country would fight for the right of the Greeks of Asia Minor to exist.
Lethal nationalism, genocide of the Greeks.
Again, thank you. That was a documentary, of course, that put together, arranged, guided, with a tremendous amount of care and consideration by the Asia Minor Pontus Hellenic Research Center. And I have to give note to our good friend and a man who really shepherded this project for a long time, Mr. Ron Levitsky, who is sitting right here. And Mr. Tatosian, please come forward if you would. Mr. Tatosian, Oscar Tatosian, is the honorary Consul General for Armenia here in Chicago.
Thank you so much. I want to appreciate the organizers of this program and the Illinois Holocaust Museum. I'm privileged to represent the Republic of Armenia and our ambassador, Lily Markuns, who's currently in Yerevan, to greet Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who arrived in Armenia yesterday. As I see the images of the tragedy 100 years ago, I can only share with you, and you know that in Armenia, we're struggling with the same challenges today. Last week, Azerbaijan attacked border towns of Armenia, and thank God, currently we're in a ceasefire. We pray that holds, and that Armenia, a small nation, who are pawns in a great game where commerce, as Professor said, commerce overtakes justice. So we're in that situation with Armenia today with resources of oil and gas and everything else. So please keep Armenia in your thoughts, and we pray for peace in that region. Thank you again for having us, and we look forward to continued collaboration between the Armenian and Greek community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Totosian. Also, for those of you who have not seen the full or complete package of the Lethal Nationalism documentary, we will be presenting it again at the Pickwick Theater. So please take note of our Facebook page for the AMPHRC, and we'll keep you informed as to when that showing is going to be. Yes.
I now would like to introduce Professor Anne Lucene, who will read an affidavit by Dr. Wilfred M. Post, an eyewitness to the Smyrna catastrophe. Post was a noted American medical missionary. He was born in Beirut in 1876, the son of medical missionary George Post, who was a physician and one of the founders of the American University of Beirut. Dr. Wilfred Post was a noted surgeon at the American Hospital in Konya. However, he was posted in Robert College in Constantinople in 1921. During that time, he was a medical director of the Near East Relief until he was forced to leave Turkey in 1925. In 1922, Dr. Wilfred Post hired an orphan boy from Sis named Manag Lucenian to be his family's houseboy. In September 1922, Dr. Post was a part of the relief group sent to Smyrna. Upon his return to Constantinople, he filed a sobering affidavit with the Office of the British Consul describing his experience in Smyrna. As a result of his efforts to aid the Greeks of Smyrna, Post was honored and decorated by the Greek government for his humanitarian work. When he returned to the United States, Dr. Post made every effort to get Manag admitted to the U.S. as a student. In 1926, the man who later became Max Lucene was finally admitted to the United States. Max became a pioneer in the printing industry, married, and had 2 daughters. One of the daughters is Professor Anne Lucene, who is joining us today to read the affidavit which she obtained from her parents. Anne Lucene is a professor of law in the University of Illinois at Chicago Law School. Born into Chicago's Armenian community, she has been active in Armenian affairs, especially as the chair of the Armenian Bar Association and in her political work with the Republic of Armenia. I welcome Anne, Professor Anne Lucene.
Okay. We landed at 10 a.m. on the 9th, and the Turkish cavalry appeared on the quay 2 hours later, having entered the city without any opposition, and they proceeded directly to the Konak, seizing a few Greek army stragglers on the way. So short a time had elapsed between the Greek evacuation and the arrival of the Turks that the city was somewhat dazed, and a little lawlessness had occurred. Nevertheless, multitudes of refugees had assembled for protection in the Greek and Armenian schools, churches, and hospitals in anticipation of the coming attack. Our party, together with the American Chief of Staff, called on the ranking Turkish officer soon after his arrival, explaining that the purpose of our visit was to afford all the help in our power to the refugees who had fled into the city, and urging him to use all his efforts to maintain law and order and not to permit the Turkish populace to retaliate upon the Christians despite the rumors of Greek excesses in the interior. He gave us the most profuse assurances that his troops would maintain perfect order, but hardly had we left the government building when rumors of looting and killing reached our ears, and by nightfall revolver shots could be heard all over the Christian quarter, and we learned that bands of armed men had already invaded the Armenian quarter and were robbing and killing the inhabitants. By the time of landing until the night of the fire, I was on shore all the time, making my headquarters at the YWCA, which was guarded by a squad of U.S. Marines, and where 300 to 400 women and children had crowded into the compound for protection. This building was located on the edge of the Armenian Quarter, and throughout those 5 days, there was almost constant firing in the neighborhood. On Saturday, things became worse. Together with other members of our party, I took a long drive covering various parts of the city and saw many dead bodies lying in the street as a result of the activity of the marauding bands the night before. As we drove through the bazaars, we saw the Armenian shops broken into. A proprietor could sometimes be seen lying indoors dead, and goods of every kind were scattered in confusion over the floors and the streets. Outside the city, many Greek houses were in flames, and many corpses of men and some women were also frequently seen. During that day, the lighters which we had seen moored to the breakwater the day before were drawn by Turkish tugs to the custom house, the occupant shrieking and wailing loudly all the time, and all the Greek and Armenian men from 18 to 45 were taken off and marched in companies to the Konak. Although there were few, if any, Hellenic soldiers among them, every Greek and Armenian of military age seemed to be regarded by the Turks as an enemy, and the slightest opposition to arrest was immediately met by a rifle shot from the troops, and we saw a number of recently killed men strewn along the quay. We heard many shots in the direction of the Konak, and were afterwards told that a considerable number of those unfortunate men had been executed after the merest farce of a trial. The night of the 10th saw matters going from bad to worse. Although a strict proclamation calling on all the inhabitants of Smyrna to give up their arms to the authorities had been issued, as usual, the order applied only to Christians. And during all the time I was in Smyrna, although I saw scores of dead Greeks and Armenians in the streets, I saw only one Turk who had been killed. The 11th passed in much the same manner as the 10th. As the situation was still growing worse, and not only Greeks and Armenians were being assaulted, but British, American, and other foreigners were being insulted and robbed, their houses entered with evidence of increasing lawlessness on every hand, our committee again called at headquarters and strongly urged Nur ad-Din Pasha to stop the looting and killing at once. By this time, large forces of troops had entered the city, and there was no excuse possible on grounds of insufficient force to restore order. Our interview was far from satisfactory. The Pasha was in a fanatical and cynical mood and intimated that the restoration of order could not be expected to take place at once, and that whatever the troops of Smyrna might do was nothing to what the Greeks had done in the interior. He assured us, however, that a new proclamation, which he was issuing, would promptly restore order to the city and bade us have our minds at ease. The looting and killing went on, however, just the same, all night, and when the morning of the 12th came, the condition of the Armenian Quarter was truly frightful. Almost every street was blocked by a mass of debris from the looted houses, broken furniture, wearing apparel, books, lamps, and glassware strewed in the streets and pavements, and there were numerous corpses in every direction. Not one Armenian house in 5 had escaped, and often on looking through the doorway, the dead body of the man or woman of the house was the first object to be seen. On looking more closely at the houses which were still intact, I saw written in chalk in Turkish characters on a number of them, either on the door or on the facade, the words Jewish house, evidently a warning to the looters to respect non-Christian property, and a clear indication that the destruction had been carefully and systematically planned. By this time, of course, the Christian population was thoroughly terrorized. Their able-bodied men had been taken away during the previous days. Multitudes of women and children had been driven out of the Christian quarters of the city and were later started on foot toward the interior, and those who remained in the Armenian quarter, either camping out in the streets or hiding in cellars, would gladly have fled elsewhere were it not for fear of the marauding bands, which were now composed of both civilians and soldiers, the latter joining freely with the former in their lawless work. By this time also, the sanitary problem had become a serious one. The stench from dead bodies was everywhere apparent, and in the bazaars, the Armenian and some of the Greek meat shops, which had been locked up for several days, were in indescribable condition. On Wednesday morning, September 13th, a very strong south wind commenced to blow, and very early in the afternoon, fire was reported in the Armenian quarter. From the YWCA building, I saw two large columns of smoke ascending from the edge of the Armenian quarter near the open space which separates it from the Turkish quarter. And the American ladies in the American schools further up in the Armenian quarter declared that shortly before the fire commenced, they had seen in two instances a soldier accompanying a Turkish civilian who was carrying a kerosene tin disappear around a corner or into a doorway, and that it was from those directions that shortly afterwards the fire appeared to take its origin. It was said by them that the fire commenced in not less than 4 separate places. The fierce wind fanned the flames, and the fire department seemed to make no headway against them. I watched the efforts of the firemen, and it seemed to me that they were playing with the fire rather than actually trying to put it out. About 4 p.m., it was evident that the city was doomed, and all the relief workers, missionaries, foreign residents, and Marines worked together to convey as many as possible of the panic-stricken population to the quay. The fires by this time had coalesced, and a terrific wind was carrying them irresistibly forwards in the direction of the quay. As evening came on, the streets presented a lurid and tragic appearance, crammed with refugees driven on partly by the flames, in many cases by threats and blows from the soldiers who took the last opportunity to hold people up and rob them whenever they could. Probably from 200,000 to 300,000 people finally found their way to the quay. The crowds along the quay became denser as the flames drew nearer, and we wondered why they did not make their escape to right and left along the quay towards the outskirts of the city. We afterwards learned that the escape in either direction was blocked by Turkish soldiers who had apparently been sent by the Turkish government to keep the people from scattering away from the city at night. It looked like a horrible death trap for those unfortunate 250,000 Christians, the raging fire quickly advancing from behind them, the sea in front of them, and armed soldiers at either end of the quay preventing their escape. Rapidly, the fire came closer to the quay until the houses fronting it were soon a raging and crackling mass of flames. The volume of shrieks and wails which arose from 250,000 throats was heartrending and could be heard above the roar of the fire and the constant rattle of what sounded like machine guns. But as though by a kindly act of providence, as the flames approached the water's edge, a countercurrent of air seemed to carry them vertically upwards so that comparatively few people were burned. The houses facing the waterfront were many of them of solid stone construction and seemed for a while to offer walls of protection for the people, when suddenly we were horrified as we looked through our glasses to see groups of soldiers gathering embers together along the seafront of these very houses and pouring some kind of liquid on them, apparently kerosene, deliberately set fire to the unconsumed houses along the waterfront. I saw at least 20 such fires started all along the quay. It looked like a deliberate effort to burn the Christians. After some hesitation on the part of the commanders of the warships of various nationalities, the claims of humanity at last superseded all questions of policy, and British, French, Italian, and American warships alike worked gallantly from midnight until dawn to save as many of the people as possible. Boats and launches from the battleships, cruisers and destroyers plied back and forth from ship to quay and back again, crowded with refugees, and had there been enough ships in the harbor, practically the whole Christian population of Smyrna could have been saved that night. As it was, every square foot of available deck space was utilized, and many thousands were saved. Unfortunately, the warships could not get permission to make the quick trips back and forth to the islands, which might have completed the evacuation of the refugees, and as time wore on and only an occasional boatload could be taken, the Turkish authorities hardened their hearts once more than ever against the Christian population, refused to let any man of military age leave at all, tried to put obstructions in the way of all Armenians, and before the end of the week arrived, they gathered the women and children by the thousands from the quay, from the fields and streets that had not been burned, and drove them off into the interior. And I make this solemn declaration, conscientiously believing the same to be true, and by virtue of the provisions of the Statutory Declaration Act of 1835, Wilfred M. Post, MD.
Thank you, Anne, for reading that sobering affidavit. Now welcome Sophia Belardos, a third-generation Greek-American who will tell her great-great-grandparents' story who escaped Smyrna while it was burning. Sophia's father found a tape where his great-grandfather describes what he witnessed. Sophia is an upstander to speak and share this information with us today, preserving the memory of this catastrophe. Now, Sophia.
My great-grandfather's name was Emmanuel Kritikos. He was born in 1909 near the town of what is now known as Didima, Turkey. Before the name of the village was changed, it was known as Yerondas. His father, my great-great-grandfather, was born on the island of Crete. It was common in those days to name someone after where they came from. So when he and his family settled in Asia Minor, the community gave him the name Kritikos. My great-grandmother's name was Maria. She was born in 1914 in the same village in Asia Minor as my great-grandfather. Her family and my great-grandfather's family went through some difficult times in Greece. I learned about my great-grandfather's life in Asia Minor through several videos, which my family were fortunate enough to have kept. I've seen many photos of him, but this is the first time I heard him speak. He spoke about the Turkish army's terrible crimes against the Greek villagers living there. They didn't want to leave their homes, but felt they had no other choice. In September of 1922, they gathered as much as they could carry and headed straight towards the nearest port city of Smyrna. He had no idea at the time what was waiting for them there. He described the horrors he saw on the roads. He saw massive fires set by the Turkish army, and at one point his brother Nikolaos witnessed the bishop of the Greek church being arrested by the Turkish army and terribly stabbed to death. Talking about it made him very emotional. My great-grandfather felt exceptionally lucky that he and his family were able to get on a boat and leave Smyrna unharmed. He could never forget the view from the boat as they left their homeland. From Smyrna, they headed towards the island of Ikaria. There they were greeted by the islanders with open arms. The people cared for and fed my great-grandfather and his family. He was forever grateful to the people of Ikaria for taking care of them, even though they only stayed for a few months. From there, they went to the island of Naxos, where they settled for about 3 years. He remembers the homes they lived in were very small and broken down, but they were thankful for their lives. In Naxos, they worked as tobacco farmers and led a very hard life. However, my great-grandmother and her family had a much harder time in Greece. From Smyrna, they tried to settle on several other islands and port cities, but they were not welcome there. Eventually, she and her family settled on the island of Naxos, where she met my great-grandfather's family. During this time, the other families from the same village in Asia Minor settled on the land in northern Greece. They named their new settlement after the name of the village in Asia Minor, Yanogas. The Greek government was generous in helping the new settlers to build homes and own farmland. So my great-grandparents' families left Naxos and headed towards northern Greece to reunite with the other villagers from Asia Minor. Once there, they worked as tobacco farmers and started their new lives. My great-grandparents married and had 4 children, one of which is my grandmother, Sophia, who I am named after. I have also visited the village of Yanogas many times and saw the home where my great-grandparents lived. The people there are very kind. When I was in Greece this past summer, my aunt Thespina told me that the year of 2022 is the 100-year anniversary of the Smyrna disaster. They celebrate that on September 24th. It is sad that no one is alive today in the village to remember the horrific events of 1922. But many there have strong memories of what happened to their families and how difficult it was to settle in Greece. I am telling the story to honor the memory of my great-grandparents, and I hope that my generation and future generations remember what happened to my family and other families who lived in Asia Minor.
Our next presenter, Dr. Paul Bartrock, will speak about the Allies' role during the Great Fire in the aftermath of World War I. He has traveled all the way from Australia to be here today, and he was actually my professor at Stockton University. Paul Bartrock is a multi-award winning scholar of genocide and the Holocaust. He is Professor Emeritus of History at Florida Gulf Coast University, Fort Myers, Florida, and Principal Fellow in the History at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Until December 2020, he was the Professor of History and Director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Research at Florida Gulf Coast University. He has held numerous other positions, including the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University, the University of South Australia, the Jewish Holocaust Center, Melbourne, Scholar in Residence at Martin Springer Institute for Teaching the Holocaust, Tolerance and Humanitarian Values at Northern Arizona University, and Virginia Commonwealth University. He is the author, co-author, and editor of 26 books, the most recent of which are The Routledge History of the Second World War, Children of the Holocaust, Heroines of Vichy France Rescuing French Jews During the Holocaust, and The Holocaust, an Encyclopedia and Document Collection, which won the Distinguished Book Award for the Society for Military History. His current projects include Genocide and Propaganda, a primary source collection, and editing the Routledge History of the First World War. I welcome Dr. Paul Bartrock.
Well, it's true, I do come from Australia, ladies and gentlemen. As one of my students once said, that's why I talk funny. But it's a very interesting thing. When I was invited to speak today via a long distance, well, everything's long distance for Australia, through a Skype meeting, or a Zoom meeting, I had no hesitation in doing so, because I want to explain something to you that 99% of Australians would not know. That right now, 100 years ago, this very week, in fact, Australia came within an inch of going to war with Turkey. Now, I bet 99%, maybe more, of Americans wouldn't know that either. I wrote a book about that several years ago. And one of the interesting things there, Australia was going to be doing that as part of the British Empire. But within days of the possibility of that happening, immediately, not within days, immediately, tens of thousands of Australian young men began lining up outside recruiting centres. Many of them were ex-World War I veterans. Don't forget, the war only ended 4 years ago. And they wanted to have another crack at the Turks, as they had at Gallipoli, as well as their younger brothers who'd missed out on the chance. And what was reinforced in the newspapers, their enthusiasm to do this, was the reports that they were getting from Smyrna at the same time. There was such horror, such disgust at what they referred to frequently as the terrible Turk. And it was in fact Kemal who had been Australia's greatest enemy at Gallipoli in 1915. So things mesh, yeah? But that's not what I want to talk to you about today. We've been fortunate today, we've been honoured to hear what happened during that terrible time in Smyrna in September 1922. I'm grateful to the speakers who've preceded me for their insights. The testimonies that we just heard just blew me away. But one question that always has concerned me: how did things get to this stage, such that the people of such a large, prosperous, harmonious and multicultural city could have suffered the fate that beheld them? I've long thought about this question. It continues to worry me. In other work that I've undertaken over many years, I've looked at how it is that historically there seem to be too many international bystanders when horror takes place. Bystanders to horror. During the Holocaust, which is a lot of the work that I've done. In Biafra, now largely forgotten, from 1967 to 1970. In Rwanda in 1994. In Myanmar in our own time. And in Smyrna in 1922. So I return to my initial question. How did things come to this? I want you to accompany me on a journey to that time, and see if we can find any answers. There we are. The First World War had seen the Ottoman Empire wage war in which the unthinkable, that is to say, military success against British, French and Russian forces, the unthinkable had been achieved on numerous occasions. But by October 1918, it was all over. But it wasn't until December 1919 that Britain, France and Italy, which hadn't been involved in the war with Turkey, turned seriously to the question of forging a settlement. The delay was crucial. In October 1918, the Turks were clearly defeated. But by December 1919, the situation had changed. The Italians had landed troops at Adalia. Greek forces had occupied Smyrna. And these incursions, in turn, had fanned the sparks of incipient Turkish resistance. The peace treaty, ultimately, that was signed between the Allies and the defeated Ottoman Empire took place at Sèvres in France, August 10th, 1920. According to the terms of that treaty, Smyrna and its surrounding district would remain in Greek hands for 5 years, after which its fate would be determined by referendum. The Dodecanese Islands went to Italy, even though, as I said, that country had never fought Turkey in the war. The Italians were happy to remain at Adulia for the time being. Concerned to maintain a balance of power, France claimed Cilicia as a sphere of influence and landed its troops there. The Straits and Constantinople were occupied by British and French forces. Western Thrace was under Greek control, Eastern Thrace under the French, and Mosul under the British. It seemed likely that an independent Armenia would be created, a lasting independent Armenia would be created in northeastern Anatolia. Turkey was, it appeared to be about to be carved up. This did not happen. Mustafa Kemal, then in the process of raising Turkish national consciousness in Anatolia, responded with immediate and implacable opposition. From his current posting at Samsun, 300 miles from Constantinople, he began rallying his troops with a vision of a new and westernized Turkey, and as we heard before, a Turkey for the Turks. Within a month of arriving at Samsun, on May 19, 1919, he gathered around him the nucleus of an army with which to challenge the Greek invasion. The Allies saw a danger in this. Sorry, beg your pardon, they saw no danger in this. All they saw was that the Greeks in and around Smyrna were being harassed by a group of what they called Turkish bandits. This misreading of the situation was obviously a clear flaw, and Kemal worked hard to exploit it. The Italians, for example, were furious that Greece had been allowed to occupy Smyrna. Knowing that, Kemal worked successfully to secure Italy's withdrawal from the alliance by pitting one against the other. By early 1920, the Italians decided that they wouldn't seek to acquire Turkish territory after all. A dismembered Turkey would be, in the words of the Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Nitti, and I quote, he said, this would be an intolerable burden, the cause of profound hatred, and would lead to future wars. Turkey was a clearly defined national unit which should not suffer mutilation. Unquote. The Italians put in this line, Kemal was able to challenge the policies of Britain and France and thereby save Turkey from possible disintegration. But it was really the Greek invasion which acted as Kemal's great catalyst. He maintained that if Greece could be defeated and the Allies became divided and alienated from each other, then perhaps Turkey could salvage something from the wreckage of the Great War. As we know, romantic and imperialistic Greeks had long sought an empire in Asia Minor, the Megali idea, which would include Constantinople and... Too many buttons on pressing. I'll go back. Stay. Constantinople and an empire in Anatolia. And in the immediate term, Smyrna was to be the prize. Kemal and the Turkish nationalists, on the other hand, were furious. They would soon become organised and infused with a single purpose. First, to drive the Greeks and then all the allies from Turkish soil. By that time, peace was nothing but an illusion. And the allies realised that Kemal would have to be subdued. However, none of the principal powers had the heart to take up arms again. That's the key here. They weren't prepared to go to war again. Leaving only Greece to enforce the demands of the Allies as set out in their own treaty, the Treaty of Sèvres. The army, the Greek army, in the words of one historian, was that, as he wrote, a small, poor nation which had been mobilised almost continuously for the last 9 years, a nation whose king had been sent into exile by Britain and France, a nation which had then been dragged into the Great War. This, he wrote, this was the army and the nation which the Allies chose because they had no choice to do their dirty work for them. Soon, the Italians, British and French began to show some measure of disquiet. None of them, as I said, were prepared to go to war. None of them was interested in a long or any sort of drawn-out conflict. And Italy and France, in particular, distanced themselves rapidly from the Greeks. As the war between Greece and Kemal's Turks spread, the Allies decided enough was enough. It was time to put a stop to the hostilities, which they didn't want, those hostilities. At a meeting in London on January 24th, 1921, they agreed to recognise the Turkish nationalist government, with Italy and France signing agreements giving themselves substantial economic advantages in Anatolia. In return, Italy withdrew its troops and its presence altogether. But there was one snag. The National Assembly, the Turks at Ankara, wouldn't ratify that agreement, the agreement signed in London. They were in no mood to be conciliatory. No mood to be conciliatory while they saw the nation's existence was still in jeopardy by virtue of the Greeks being there. The Allies could concede what they liked, but Kemal refused to enter negotiations. At this, France began to show concern and searched for a way to withdraw with its honour intact. The British government, we have here British troops in Constantinople doing their mobilising thing. The British government was unwilling to abandon Greece. By British Prime Minister Lloyd George, by the time we get to September 1922, Prime Minister David Lloyd George actually said in Parliament, or in the aftermath of the discussion in Parliament, we were prepared to fight and we would win. He was as simple as that in his statement. The British government was of the view, not for Smyrna, but for British interests alone, that if Britain was forced by the Turks to leave, only bad things for Britain could follow. There'd be a massive blow to British prestige, a threat to the imperial lifeline in the Eastern Mediterranean, a fear that one concession could lead to demands in other areas. These were all major factors contributing to the British stance. And with this in mind, Britain actively encouraged the Greeks in the prosecution of their offensive in Anatolia. As I said, the Italians had discontinued their active participation in the region. The French were looking for an opening to do likewise. And in view of these developments, Greece had no other option but to redouble its efforts, its war effort. And we know what happened from there. By the end of summer 1921, Greek troops had reached the Sakarya River, only about 45 miles from Ankara. And it was there that the Turks made their stand. Holding the Greeks, the offensive was halted and then turned around. And at this moment, the French government saw the writing on the wall. The French said, right, we're out of here. October 20th, 1921, a treaty between France and nationalist Turkey was signed. This was Mustafa Kemal's greatest diplomatic victory so far. For the first time, his nationalists had won official recognition and on their own terms. The victory also showed Kemal in unmistakable terms that the Allies had finally fallen out. The marriage of wartime convenience was very much on the rocks. The British government was furious. No Italy, no France, Greece in retreat, and a point rarely made, the British military authorities were making informal overtures about how to avoid a confrontation should Kemal's troops get as far as Constantinople. For the Turks, it now remained only for the Greeks to be expelled. When this happened, they reasoned, the British would reach an accommodation. The nationalists the Turks worked furiously, feverishly, throughout the first half of 1922 to achieve a negotiated settlement with Britain. But Kemal realised that only through military victory would he be listened to. And that meant defeating the Greeks and driving them out of Turkey. The event clinching Kemal's decision to make a final military assault came not in Turkey but in London, where Prime Minister David Lloyd George fixed Britain's position in Parliament, like I said, on August 4th, 1922. Lloyd George placed full blame for the failure of negotiations on the Turks, at the same time giving encouragement to the Greeks, as he said, to wage war with their full strength. In a veiled message to Kemal, he then suggested that if the Greeks really wanted to occupy Constantinople, they could easily do so, provided the Allies were still there. And with that, the damage was done. That was Kemal's loophole, because he knew that he'd been forcing splits in the Allies to get out of there throughout all this time. Both sides now girded themselves for a final confrontation. The Turks, because they felt they'd have to win the war before the British and the Australians came in directly on Greece's side, and because the Turks knew that their own army, their own exhausted army, couldn't survive another winter. The Greeks knew they had to see things through to the end if they were ever to gain Constantinople. Kemal was urged to immediate action by both France, from a distance, Italy, and also, as we heard before, by the Soviet Union, which saw itself as a champion of revolutionary movements as it understood Kemal's to be. Arms were piling in. An all-or-nothing campaign was planned by Kemal for Western Anatolia, focusing on, as he called it, the liberation of Smyrna. Kemal ordered a general offensive for August 26, 1922. So we're getting towards this 100 years now. The onslaught which followed saw Greek defeats on all fronts. With the Greek armies crumbling everywhere, Kemal was not about to allow negotiations to weaken the momentum of the offensive, and soon the reconquest of Smyrna was no longer the issue. Instead, Kemal began speaking in terms of negotiations over the future of Eastern Thrace and Constantinople. The Greek defeat that followed was total and unequivocal. By the time the Turkish infantry had positioned itself for a final attack on Smyrna, much of Western Anatolia had been devastated. And as we've heard already, on September 9th, a mere 15 days after Kemal had launched his offensive, Smyrna was taken. The Greek army had, as Kemal had sought, the Greek army had been pushed into the sea. Now only the fractured Allied presence at Constantinople and the Dardanelles remained outside nationalist Turkish control. For the Greeks, the military collapse and the loss of Smyrna was devastating. It was clear from the position of the Greek military and from the position of the Greek government that Greece had been abandoned by the Allies. Within Greece, the political upshot of the defeat was an army-led revolution in which the government was overthrown. King Constantine made the scapegoat and deposed for a second time. The Turkish entry to Smyrna confirmed the Allies' worst fears. And today we've heard something of what happened next. I won't repeat what we've already heard. Ultimately, it only need be said, the destruction of the Greeks of Smyrna assumed a genocidal character. And despite what some might prefer to suggest, in my view, the question of genocide occurring at the hands of the Turks isn't up for debate. The wartime alliance was not strong enough or committed enough to meet the challenge posed by the Turkish resurgence. Fundamental question always has to be, well, why? Indeed, what did they seek from their victory over Turkey? Britain wanted above all to open the straits and to ensure that they remained open with clear access to Constantinople and the Black Sea. Well, why? Well, trade was important. Eastern Thrace had to be protected from a Turkish invasion. British prestige could not be allowed to suffer at the hands of a so-called inferior Muslim population. There were imperialist dimensions of this as well, as the British were concerned about what the message would be that would be sent to its Muslim inhabitants of the empire, such as in India. The French and Italian positions, by comparison, were far more straightforward, based on the pragmatic view that an accommodation would just have to be reached with the Turks. Neither France nor Italy wanted to sit in Constantinople waiting for something to happen. And as I said before, nobody wanted to engage in military conflict. The Italians, the French, preferred to impose tight commercial controls on the Turkish government as a guarantee for their investments. They were also committed to the preservation of Turkish territorial integrity, arguing that slicing up Anatolia was unnecessary. And this was something the final player in the drama, Greece, didn't appreciate. Although given the chance to pursue its imperial ambitions, a full-scale invasion of Anatolia at the precise moment that the forces of modern Turkish nationalism were beginning to emerge, quite just simply exceeded Greece's military capacity. The Allies, looking on, had mixed feelings. While Britain fully supported Greece, France and Italy became cooler and cooler towards Greece achieving the Megali idea. By the time Mustafa Kemal had turned the Greeks around and begun his own advance, the French and Italians had already denounced the Greek invasion and reached an accommodation with Kemal's regime. Britain, left alone to support the Greeks, had the foundation of its Turkish policy knocked from under it once the Greeks were pushed into the sea at Smyrna. The result, as we know, as we've seen today, but as we've probably all been aware of for some time already, saw the fall and subsequent destruction of Smyrna in tears and sorrow. Popular memory still grieves for the losses of 1922, in which not only the Megali idea had collapsed, but a massive number of Greeks, we've heard some of the figures today, lost their lives for no other obvious reason than their religion and their ethnic background. It's often been said that the past is another country where things are done differently. But perhaps the past in 1922 is sometimes not all that different from our own present 1 century later. What Smyrna tells us clearly is that when lives are at risk, there is a need for an 11th commandment. Thou shalt not be a bystander. I want to end with the words of the Canadian general and one of my personal heroes, Lieutenant General Romain Dallaire, officer commanding United Nations forces in Rwanda in 1994. Apropos of what I just said. He made a statement which has become the one that by which I live my life, which if you haven't heard it, I commend to all of you. As he said, all humans are human, and there are no humans more human than others. Ευχαριστώ.
Thank you, Dr. Bartrap. Our final presenter today is our very own Kelly Zaney. She is the Senior Vice President of Education and Exhibition at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, where she provides strategic leadership and planning for all education, programming, and exhibition initiatives. During her 20-year tenure, Zaney has been instrumental in the development of the museum's broader genocide and human rights mission and vision. Zaney currently serves as co-chair of the Illinois Holocaust and Genocide Commission and sits on the board of directors for the Association of Holocaust Organizations and Educators Institute for Human Rights. She is an amazing genocide scholar and mentor, and I welcome Kelly to the stage.
Thank you, Jessica. So I understand that I stand between you and a ball, or perhaps the Bears-Packers game, depending on where you stand. So I will keep this very brief, mindful that we are well beyond our time. So I want to just first give thanks again on behalf of the museum to our partners, the Asia Minor and Pontos Hellenic Research Center, the amazing John and Maria Davis, George Mavropoulos, His Eminence, the Consul Generals for joining us, and all our distinguished presenters, George, Constantine, and Paul. Thank you. It's a privilege to be with all of you as we join together as friends and colleagues for this incredibly special and memorable afternoon. As we mark this anniversary, I come to you as an educator, someone who has had the incredible opportunity to engage teachers and students and the general public about not only the history, but the lessons of historical and contemporary genocide. Today, we commemorate and gather to mark the 100th anniversary of one of the darkest days of Hellenism at Smyrna. George Horton, who we heard a little bit about before, the U.S. Consul General at Smyrna, left Smyrna aboard an American battleship. He saw, and I quote, "flames raging now over a vast area, brighter and brighter, presenting a scene of awful and sinister beauty. Nothing was lacking in the way of atrocity, lust, cruelty, and all that fury of human passion. One of the keenest impressions which I brought away with me from Smyrna was a feeling of shame that I belonged to the human race." The Chicago News reporter John Clayton, following the Smyrna genocide and after witnessing the scale of the disaster close up, decided he could no longer write the sort of censored reports Admiral Mark Bristol expected of him. In describing the events at Smyrna, he wrote, and I quote, "The loss of life is impossible to compute. The streets are littered with dead, except for the squalid Turkish quarter. Smyrna has ceased to exist. The problem of the minorities is here solved for all time. No doubt remains as to the origin of the fire. The torch was applied by Turkish regular soldiers." These two testimonies represent a fragment of a much larger odyssey, but it reflects a pattern so often found in many genocide eyewitness accounts: the abject brutality of the perpetrator, the silence of the bystander, and often the will and the determination of the eyewitnesses or survivors. Each one of these stories of those who were murdered, survived, or who were eyewitnesses to the atrocities committed at Smyrna, each one is a story filled with the same elements, along with their own uniquely complicated twists and turns. These two stories shared along with those we have heard today speaks to one of the purposes of remembrance and education, and it is simply this: to tell the story. Each one of the victims we remember today represents a story, a human life, albeit a story and life cut short. Years from now, it is these individual stories and the stories of those who survived, along with the lessons they each implore us to learn, as His Eminence reminded us today. The complexities of human behavior, the legacies of prejudice and discrimination, and the destructive force of indifference. These are the lessons we must continue to teach. It is these stories that will need to be key to the future of continued awareness and knowledge of the atrocities at Smyrna, told by the descendants we heard today, the community and museums like ours. This is one way that we will help keep the history alive as we mark a century from these atrocities. It is also a solemn lesson that the failure to account for atrocity inflicted on a people, to not share their stories, let alone remember them, is harmful to more than the affected communities. It is a message to future dictators and tyrants that they may be free to do so the same. Additionally, as we mark this anniversary, it is our duty to reflect on lessons learned. Such events seem so far beyond the trivialities of everyday life, even beyond the tragedies of everyday life, that we tend to say to ourselves that we can never fully understand them because we cannot imagine ourselves experiencing them. However, there is a truth to the human condition that is alarming today as it was 175, 20 years ago, and even today. Human beings have committed and are committing these atrocities. When one looks at Smyrna, the Holocaust, Rwanda, Syria, or even the atrocities being committed in Ukraine, the horror is not that it deviates from human norms. The horror is that it does not. The bonds that can hold us together can swiftly disappear, and societies can rapidly revert to a capacity for violence and brutalization that is far too easy to incite in the dark corners of the human heart. No country is immune from the targeting of the so-called other. And while each individual is bound into a larger fabric of humanity, this can have darker implications for society. Because at its deepest level, a society can tell us who we are, but also who we are not. And when we forget our shared humanity and dehumanize the other, we unravel every thread of peace that binds us together. When we use our differences to rob others of their intrinsic worth and humanity, we tear apart the very edifice of progress that we stand. What today's commemoration reminds us of is that it is not enough to curse the darkness of the past. Above all, we must illuminate the future as a signal to the advent of a humane world, where men and women are brothers and sisters, where the safe must speak out for the imperiled, and where no genocide goes unopposed. It is said that remembrance is a sacred act, which has the power to unite us, remind us of who we are and what we are capable of, and to crystallize a shared vision of who we want to be. This afternoon, and now more than ever, as we stand together in remembrance, we must affirm the obligation to recognize our shared responsibility to humanity, rediscover our collective courage, and duty to teach others so that we may not live idly and forgetfully, but to maintain constant vigilance as custodians of this memory we share today. We must not allow denial of any kind to persist, to extinguish the torch of truth for the world. We must continue to speak, to educate, for those whose voices were silenced 100 years ago, for those who survived, and the descendants whose voices must still be heard, so that we remember and pledge never to forget. Thank you. So we want to give the official close for this evening, invite the amazing Maria Davis and Jessica back up, who were really the true leaders in organizing today in partnership with George. Thank you, George. Thank you. Thank you, George, very, very much. And Stavros and others, thank you for joining us today. John, for being an amazing MC, as you always are. To our incredible scholars, to our consul generals, again to His Eminence, and for all our distinguished participants, thank you so much for taking the time to coming. I have no doubt you all look fabulous this evening at the ball. Drive safely, hopefully traffic's a lot better, and thank you again for coming.